welcome to our fifth and final class in the Sustainable Yard Care series. So this one is focused on how to manage yard pests in both in your yard and your garden. We actually are doing this class for the first time because we sent a survey out at the end of last year, and this was a very popular topic. So we put together a new class for you all, so hopefully you enjoy it. It's a big topic and there's a lot to cover. My name is Kristen Covey, since I haven't introduced myself yet, and I'm an educator with the King County Wastewater Treatment Division, and I'm going to be facilitating the class and kind of helping with any tech support. But we have brought back 3 of the previous speakers from the series to do this class. So we have both David Jackson and Joe Crumbly from the Snohomish Conservation District who are presenting. And we also have Monica Vanderveeren from the King County Wastewater Treatment Division. So thank you to all of you for being here and for sharing all of your knowledge with us. I've in the past spent a little bit of time talking about the background of this series, but since this is our last class and I know we are kind of short on time today since there's 3 speakers, I'm going to talk about looking ahead. So we offered these classes in the series in this box. So if you missed any of them, they are available to watch on our King County Wastewater Treatment Division YouTube page. So all of them will be up there for a long time. So feel free to go back and watch those. And next year we don't know what it's going to look like, but we're hoping that we will be able to hold these classes in person at Brightwater Center, which is located in Woodinville, Washington. So if you are near to Woodinville, Washington, hopefully we will see you in person next year. We do these annually in the winter. Excuse me. So if you aren't local, we're talking about how we can still support those that can't make it in person. So we're thinking about how we can actually do some sort of a kind of a webinar ahead of time and post those for folks that can't make it in person. So hopefully you will all be included next year, depending on what it looks like. All right, so for today's class, since we have 3 presenters, they're each going to actually take a subtopic of this pests topic. And Monica, Joe, and David will talk for about 25 minutes each, which will leave about 15, actually more like 10 to 15 minutes, I should say. Ignore that slide. At the end for Q&A. So we have time at the end for questions, but we also know that questions will come up during their presentation. So feel free to put those into the chat box while they're talking, and the 2 that are not presenting can take turns answering those for you. So if your question gets missed, I'm going to keep track of everything that doesn't get answered, and we will ask those at the Q&A session at the end. And hopefully we'll get everyone's questions answered. I know that's important. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and pass it off to Monica to start off the presentation.
Okay, and let me know if that is it sharing?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristen.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody's from a lot of different places, but what I can tell you about the Pacific Northwest is we have so many pests. There's no way we can cover this in one Zoom meeting. You would be falling asleep on the other side of the computer if we tried to run through every pest. So what we want to talk about is sort of a big picture view of what is a pest, and then some control methods that we can all live with. So I'll give that overview in the beginning, and I'll include a few pests along the way that we can talk about. I'm seeing some of them already. Joe will focus on garden pests, and there are all sorts of different garden pests. And then David will focus on plants that are pests. And then again, as Kristen said, we should have time for Q&A, but definitely put questions in the chat. We've been answering along the way. The first thing I want to say is that you should really give yourself some grace if you either have a pest problem that you've ignored, you've created a pest problem, you didn't even know you had a pest problem until somebody pointed it out, or you've made a tragic mistake handling it. everybody has. So don't be embarrassed. I work with restorationists at King County. If you ever come out to Brightwater, we have a massive landscape here. We have a lot of other landscapes we're maintaining, and we learn over time. I've also volunteered to give presentations for 15 years with landscape architects or horticulturists and other restorationists. Great people. We've all made mistakes, so don't worry about that. Um, and the other thing you should know is that pest control practices have really changed over time. They originally were really based, and to this day they are to a certain extent, on very large scale landscapes. They're not necessarily what we're dealing with in our landscapes at home. So I'm on 9 acres, and I still consider that a pretty modest landscape to maintain. So if you look at how we've historically managed codling moth, it's a good sort of lesson in how pest management has changed. Codling moth is now present on 6 continents, if you did not know that, and it attacks fruit trees, and the larvae mess up your fruit. So from the late 1800s to World War II, we used lead arsenate slurry on apple trees and in other fruit trees and orchards. There are super fun sites in the United States that were apple orchards, and we have 750,000 acres of lead arsenic contaminated land in Washington state. Okay, so we thought this was a great idea, and then they realized there were problems with it. So in World War II, we found something we thought, well, this is a great alternative to lead arsenate slurry, and it can also be broadcast to control mosquitoes because malaria was a problem at the time. Okay, so we were like, great, we have this alternative. That alternative was DDT. Okay, so we used a lot of DDT. It was literally 40,000 tons a year. It still is persistent in the environment and in our tissues. It had a lot of impacts on a lot of different species. The thing many Americans remember is that it accumulated up the food chain from small animals to big ones, and birds of prey were especially affected. It caused their eggshells to thin. So we almost lost the peregrine falcon at the right and our bald eagles to DDT. Okay. It looked like a good solution, but it wasn't in the end. It turns up 80% of codling moth larvae are actually eaten by birds. And there are other measures that you can take. Joe's going to talk more about this. So now when we look at pests, we have sort of an intersection of our good intentions. We want to have healthy food that we can eat, and we don't want our houses damaged. I saw somebody talked about a vehicle that can happen too. And so we really want to kind of protect things, but have enough knowledge and intentionality as we go at it so that we're protecting the environment, right? And there are tons of resources. So we're going to give you a lot of resources. If you need more, again, put questions in the chat. We may find them later for you. But this is a good example. Our Department of Ecology has a fertilizer database. So today, one of the leftover large landscape practices is to buy like lawn products. So you buy bag 1, 2, 3 for spring, summer, fall. A lot of these have heavy metals in them. Most people don't realize that's the inert ingredients. So you can go on the Department of Ecology website and actually check whether you are using a compound that has heavy metals in it on your lawn, because they're going to accumulate. Just arsenic is a heavy metal. So they're going to accumulate just like they did with the lead arsenate slurry. So what Joe and David and I are going to focus on is integrated pest management. This is a definition from the U.S. Department or Environmental Protection Agency. It's an effective and environmentally sensitive approach to pest management that relies on a combination of common sense practices. Link is at the bottom. There's a lot more information that goes with that. The first thing you really want to do is monitor and identify what pests you have, right? You want to make sure that you're actually approaching the right thing. Really know their life cycle, okay, and how to attack them without causing other damage. What are things you can do to prevent them? A lot of times, as you'll see, we're creating issues that make pests really welcome in our yards. And then various different control methods, emphasizing the least harmful first. So let's talk about what is a pest. You saw a lot of this in the chat as people were coming in when we said, why is your pest a pest? We can have tremendous damage to things we care about, okay? Rodents can do horrific damage to structures and infrastructure. Gardens and crops, we talked about that. Landscaping, people talked about it's taking me time, money, labor to control. Pests may be things that are at our neighbors and irritating us, or we've got something in our area. Cats digging in people's gardens and pooping is really bad for people, and it can cause a public health threat because a lot of outdoor cats are hunting rodents. 60 million Americans are wandering around with toxoplasmosis that they get from cats who hunt rodents. Okay, so even somebody's pet cat can be your pest. Okay. And then you can also have non-native species that threaten native species or the environment. So both of the species on the right are non-native and introduced. Bullfrogs on the bottom, bullfrogs will eat anything they can shove in their mouths. And so that can include our native Pacific chorus frog, up to small birds and other like snakes and things. Bullfrogs are awful. Sometimes you have to look at it and say, do I really have a pest problem, or is it an expectation that I have and it's maybe not really in tune to nature? So rats, of course, are a pest. Rats are not native here. We do have native species in the North America. Most of what we're dealing with are imported rats. Okay, and they do a lot of damage. They can literally chew through concrete and start fires and all sorts of stuff. Okay, but if you look at these leaves here, they've got holes in them. Oh my gosh, when I first had this happen to me, it's like, what is eating my plants? And I checked and it turned up they're native leafcutter bees. Okay, so pollinators, bees and other pollinators across the nation are really under threat. And I'm not necessarily that wedded to not having leaf damage as long as it's not killing the plant. Okay, but if I start spraying or trying to manage these bees, I'm probably going to kill a lot of other insects. And then maybe I'm not going to get as much food. And then there's not as many insects for birds to eat. And then I'm starting to put pesticide up the food chain. So sometimes it's just actually saying, do I really have a best pest problem? You want to identify what the organism is, and then saying, is that an expectation that things will be perfect? You see this with turf lawn, and people want it to look like astroturf and not have any imperfections or be too long or things like that. That's where those expectations can clash with something that's not really technically a pest. We all contribute to pests, myself including. So this is our Asian, the giant murder hornet that was in the news this year. It sounds horrid, and they made it sound even more horrid than it really is. This thing did not buy a plane ticket and get on a plane and come here. Okay, it was imported in a storage container. It got into a wood pallet. Maybe it was in like plant materials. It got here somehow that we carried it around. We have been carrying pests around for millennia. In fact, rats have been traveling with people for thousands and thousands of years, and they probably became dinner on long ocean voyages when people ran out of food. Okay, so we've been moving things around. You may still be doing that. So some of this is being aware of when we purchase things, are we potentially contributing to future pest issues? Okay, we also do a great job of creating environments that foster pests. Rats are a great example. Mice, throw mice in with this. Rats will eat anything, okay, including insulation. So you do want to keep them out of your house. But what do we have in this area? A lot of leftover fruit and vegetables, right? Pet food, some people leave out pet food, garbage. Even if you do none of that, if you leave your cat or dog poop out there, I read in the newspaper that rats will get as big as cats eating dog poop. We feed our pets pretty nutritious food. And if you are not picking up and disposing of your pet waste, it's getting eaten by rats. Okay, if you have shelter for them, trees and shrubs that are leaning over your house, ivy, they love ivy. They can live in there. They have a food source. It's a safe place from predators. Okay, so you may have a lot of these baseline issues that are creating a rat problem. Poisoning rats is, I'm never going to recommend it because you poison them and they wander off sick. It can be your cat or your dog or a hawk or owl or eagle that eats that sick rat. We have a huge problem with raptors dying from rat poison. Okay. There's a lot of, we'll talk about barriers. There's a lot of things you can do to keep them out of places you don't want and make their lives unpleasant. And then also just keeping some of the things that really help them, keeping those conditions down. This is dandelion. Dandelion has spread, it's uncontrollable, it's spread everywhere. If you're like me, I have lawn over, I have a septic tank and I need to be able to access it. So I'm not going to put really nice plantings there because I have to actually, somebody has to get a hose across the yard to pump that thing out, right? You may need to keep lawn for a homeowners association or covenant or neighborhood rules. Well, when you're looking at your dandelions, I put a link here to our natural lawn care. What do dandelions like? They like sun. They are fine on compact soil. They like it a little acidic, right? So if your lawn, our lawns often because of the rain get very compact, they tend to go acidic. And if you're mowing it really short, they're getting sun. So you may use a harsher control method to get rid of these, but if you look at it, how could you change the conditions? It might be something as simple as putting some beautiful shrubs in to create some shade, and then aerating and overseeding with a shade variety of grass, because dandelions and buttercups the same way, they do not like shade. Right. So finding out, this is what integrated pest management says, is finding out what your pest is, what conditions it's like that you might be creating, and when you get into a control mode, removing those conditions. Dandelions are too widespread to think that you can keep, you'll ever get rid of them forever. They're going to come back, but you can control the conditions. Tolerance is a control option. So in our area, Sarah and I talked about it in the landscaping for wildlife class, we've altered the area a lot and we've removed the trees that provided cavities for a lot of birds and squirrels and things like that to nest. Okay, so I get bats and birds in my barn, and people don't like the nest because then the birds, when the little babies are born, they actually poop on the floor. Well, if you can be sympathetic to the birds because they have nowhere else to nest but man-made structures anymore, and put down cardboard or newspaper, pick up that poop and use it in your landscaping for mulch. It's actually nutritious. Okay, these birds are also eating mosquitoes for you and other insects, and bats are as well. Again, accepting some leaf damage if it's a native species that coexists with the plant. Something like tent caterpillar. We hate tent caterpillar. They make huge tents and then you see larvae eating the leaves. Here's the thing, tent caterpillars are really nutritious for birds. They actually had an ecological function in mature forests. They would defoliate enough to get sunlight to the forest floor and allow other things to grow up, increasing forest diversity. Now, they are a problem if you have young plants that are trying to take hold and they're eating all the leaves, but you can manually remove them at that point. But accepting some issues kind of helps you. Coyotes and other predators, we do not as humans like predators. We have created a big imbalance by removing insect, mammal, bird predators, all sorts of things. But predators actually can be your best friend. Barriers, we talked about hardware cloth, metal hardware cloth as your friend with rat problems, finding out where rats are coming into your house, and using metal hardware cloth can super help you. Flashing can help you on things that are crawling up stuff because it's slick and they can't get over it. There's a link on the bottom. When you put up any kind of nest, you're trying to have birds, but then all of a sudden the rats and squirrels are getting in there and eating your little baby birds. Actually having these barriers can super help you. And then having the appropriate nest box to make sure that the hole size isn't one where crows can easily get their beaks in. Also enclosing livestock. So we used to have a stable population of coyotes in my area. And then the neighbor moved in with sheep and didn't enclose them and shelter them properly. So the coyotes started eating the lambs and he shot the coyotes, which is legal. We then got horrific amounts of rodents and rabbits. We had rabbits everywhere. And so then he finally gave up on the sheep because you can never completely get rid of coyotes. Got beef cattle. They don't bother the beef cattle. I see them out there running among them. Our rabbits are down. Okay. But if you do have chickens, or in Bozeman, people were raising chickens, they were having to kill grizzly bears because people didn't want to put up electric fencing, and the bears would get habituated to the chickens. So trying to find barriers that will keep things away is a simple method as well. Harassment is another technique. Joe will talk about it a little more. Somebody gave me one of these as a gift. I don't think any but animal thought this was a great horned owl. And so there can be some issues where animals get habituated to the thing that you're trying to harass them with. If you have near neighbors, like we had, somebody was doing screaming bird sounds down the road and we're in a quiet rural area, it can be a little grating. But both Joe and David will talk about harassment options for different pests, but this is another way that you can kind of approach this. Pets can work as harassment. The problem is that if your pet, like I have a dog, if I let him start harassing one animal, he's not going to stop there. It becomes a game for them. So for relocation, I'm going to say for the most part, just say no. It is, first of all, not allowed with wildlife in the state, or any animals. You're not supposed to be moving animals around because you can disrupt other populations. You can spread disease. It's really problematic. And the outcomes can be terrible. So this cat just appeared probably 5 days ago in my property. A lot of people dump cats out by us. I told you we have a lot of coyotes. I haven't seen it for 2 days. I was going to trap it and bring it to a shelter because it was never going to make it in my area. The outcome for a deposited animal is not usually good. The only time I would say you can do this is, say you have a lot of Nootka rose or salmonberry, or you have Western bleeding heart, which is a native plant and it's getting into your food garden. Dig it up. Lots of people will love to have your cedar seedlings and your native plants. Okay. But for animals, it's kind of a big no. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife did relocate beavers to the Yakima Indian Reservation, but this is the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So they've been vetted. There's a monitoring plan, there was a permit, there's a whole process that goes with that, and it's very carefully done so that you aren't having problems go from one place to the other. You may have to kill things. I do not like killing things, but you may have to, whether it's plants or insects or animals. I was horrified to find out I have viburnum leaf beetle. It comes from Asia. It's eating my high bush cranberry. And I talked to the Department of Ag and they said, it just arrived in Snohomish County a few years ago. And they said, talk to WSU, have got to get rid of it or it will become a very widespread pest. There are other people that have it and WSU is helping them. So they will make sure that that's what I have. And then they will give me kind of a tarry substance that I can use on the trees to prevent the larvae from crawling up, and eventually the population will die out. So lethal control can sometimes be really necessary for a number of different reasons. You can let nature help you with lethal control. Dragonflies eat mosquito larvae and other insects. I talked about coyotes. I have raptor perches. So there are a lot of and Joe will talk about this too, beneficial insects. You can let nature kind of help you clean up an issue. I moved into a house with a lawn and started fighting crane fly and then finally gave up. I don't have a crane fly problem because I have actually good beneficial insects that take care of them. Trapping is an option. The thing you have to be careful with traps is that they have to be specific. Okay, so one of the lethal traps people use are those big sticky traps. You can get them small size or big. If you just lay them out anywhere, you will not only get rodents, you will get snakes, frogs, small birds, anything that lands on them is going to get stuck and die. Okay, so you want to have a specific trap if you have to trap, and then you have to have a plan for what you're going to do with the creature afterward. So the wildlife rehab people have told me that just trapping pests on your property and bringing it to them, they're in the business of rehabilitation and always slightly underfunded and always busy. So they're only looking for sick and injured animals, not pest animals, okay? So you have to have a plan. I've been told that if a nuisance, quote unquote, nuisance animal has to be trapped by someone else, it will then be euthanized. So it's an easier lift for most people with things like insects or slugs. So if you're going to use insect traps, you can have very specific insect traps like the gypsy moth traps that Department of Ag puts up. They have a pheromone in them that's supposed to attract gypsy moths only, and then there's a sticky trap where they can capture them. And then this is my last slide. Joe's going to talk a little bit more about chemical controls. This is an option, but you should decide whether it's your first option or your last. And again, deal with underlying conditions. Here's the problem. If you start with a chemical control and you don't correct the situation, you are in chemical warfare forever. You are just going to keep going and going and going. And as I said, things like your weed and feeds, if you're going to have to keep applying them every year, you're going to keep applying a certain percentage of heavy metal to your lawn, and it's going to build up in your soil. And again, chemical controls, Joe will talk about this target specificity. You want to make sure that the thing you're focused on, you're just getting rid of that thing and not having this whole broadcast effect on every other insect, every other plant, and you're having a secondary effect. Okay, and again, really recommend that you have a plan to correct the conditions that are attracting the pest and allowing it to be a pest in your space. So that's kind of the overview. I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Joe.
So thank you for everyone for joining in. Again, I'm Joe Crumley, Urban Agriculture Program Coordinator for the Snohomish Conservation District, here to elaborate a little more on garden pests for you. So today we're going to go over sustainable pest management applicable for small scale locations like Monica had mentioned, and why pests may be attracted to your garden, some underlying issues to address prior to implementing organic chemical controls, and resources on pest identification and management. As Monica said, identifying which specific pest you're dealing with, it can definitely be the first step before finding what kind of method you want to utilize to mitigate that issue. So some common sense practices to keep pests away include avoiding excess fruit and vegetables from accumulating, growing a diverse variety of crops, and reducing food waste exposed in open air compost. As you can imagine, there's certain pests that will seek out specific vegetable or fruit varieties. And so the more you can actually spread out those varieties in your yard, the less likely those pests can transfer from one tree or one produce variety to another, which we'll go into in a little more detail in just a moment. So when I mentioned avoiding open air compost and food waste in there, of course, you're going to maybe attract rats and rodents and birds, various insects. So these are some great examples for above and below ground compost systems to help keep food scraps away from yard and garden pests. If you do have a lot of stagnant water in your yard, you're going to want to avoid the below ground compost. As you can imagine, it's not going to do its job if it gets a little oversaturated being below ground there. These are some examples of what not to add in your compost system. Most of these, again, are kind of common sense. You can use egg shells if you rinse them out. But of course, greasy, oily foods, meat and seafood, dairy, and as Monica had mentioned, rodents will even eat your pet waste. And so keeping these out of your compost systems are ideal for reducing garden pests in your yard. Let nature help. Monica talked a little bit about this, but of course some bats, birds, frogs, toads, nematodes, spiders, wasps, and beetles can all benefit your garden by eating other insects that may do it harm. Owls and hawks hunt rodents. Many birds use insects to feed their young, and beneficial insects like dragonflies and wasps will prey on species we don't like. So the more that you can implement habitat in your garden area and encouraging wildlife, the less you're going to have to rely on some of these other barrier methods and chemical control options. So with the Snohomish Conservation District, we work with a lot of school gardens, community gardens, and there's unfortunately been a lot of circumstances where they've come to us and said, hey, you know what, our neighbors or maintenance crews or what have you have utilized some pesticides and herbicides, not even on their property, but near or adjacent to their property, which have negatively affected their fruit trees, their pollinator gardens, beehives, those kinds of things where they no longer were able to utilize those, especially in school settings due to public health concerns. And so they just had to start over from scratch. And so it's really important to work with your neighbors and make sure that you're kind of reducing the possibility of being negatively affected by non-organic chemical controls in your garden space. It's really important just to talk with your neighbors, communicate with them, and reduce nearby pesticides affecting your food garden. So one neat thing is you can actually purchase beneficial predatory insects online. I've had some great luck in the past managing community garden spaces where we implemented, ladybugs we ordered online, praying mantis we ordered online. And so there's some great options for beneficial predatory insects to help control pests we don't want. We've listed some common websites to purchase beneficial predatory insects on our resource page at the end of this section of the PowerPoint as well. And although I'm not covering necessarily which of these predatory beneficial insects will target what specific garden pest, feel free to reach out to me through email at a later date, and I'd be happy to give you some more insight on which beneficial predatory insect addresses what specific insect pest. So some great things that you can do to implement in your garden space prior to looking into barriers and chemical controls is thinking about what kind of garden plan and layout you can have that will actually attract beneficial insects, providing shelter, food, nectar, and that kind of thing. And so there's three plant families that will actually help increase the capacity for these beneficial predatory insects to come make a habitat in your yard, which include the daisy, carrot, and mint family. And one common option that a lot of folks may have heard of is the marigold flower. And so these actually have a scent that discourage a lot of insect pests, and they also attract beneficial nematodes. So there are a couple different kinds of nematodes, beneficial and pest nematodes, which are known often as roundworms, and they're very, very small. But this marigold variety actually is a great flower to not only deter a lot of insect pests, but also to attract beneficial nematodes as well. So you can kind of think about in your garden plan, you can just intermix them sporadically, or sometimes folks will like to use them as kind of a moat around a castle and have it as kind of a barrier option for your garden space. One neat thing that I came across was the amount of and the capacity that beneficial insects save US farmers each year, which is around 4.5 billion in free pest management to US farms annually, which is quite a bit, pretty substantial. And so one practice to implement this that's been utilized a lot in the UK and also becoming more and more common in the upper Midwest in the United States is creating something called a Beetle Bank, which is basically where you're harboring a habitat for beneficial predatory ground beetles and other beneficial predatory insects by implementing native grasses and flowers in a strip alongside crops. And of course, this is going to maybe depend where you're located in the United States or across the world as far as what native grasses and wildflowers you would choose in that area, but that's something to consider as well. Similar to the marigold example, this would kind of border the crops that you're growing.
So can you repeat the marigold? What was it specifically?
Yes. So the marigold flowers are a great way to deter a lot of insect pests by the scent and the smell they give off. And then they also will actually attract nematodes, beneficial nematodes, under the soil's surface. So they kind of have a dual purpose there. And a common practice for folks to utilize with marigolds is bordering the garden, and it acts as kind of like a moat to a castle, just kind of acting as a barrier around your garden space, which works quite well for a wide variety of insect pests.
Is it any marigolds?
You know, that's a good question. I know that there are many marigolds that work. If folks have specific questions about what marigolds that work, I'd be happy to follow up in more detail. I don't know off the top of my head the names of each one that serve that purpose, but I know there are many marigold varieties that do that. And then moving on to tolerance. So with tolerance, one interesting thing is that only about 5% of the bugs in your yard are considered pests. And so just keeping in mind when you're utilizing different practices and methods that are going to reduce certain bug populations, and I'll go into this in a little more detail in a moment, but you really want to, you know, number one, identify what you're dealing with, and then choose a method that will really target that specific pest as much as possible to avoid the chances of harming other beneficial insect pests. If you can imagine, only 5% of the bugs in your yard are insect pests, the vast majority are going to serve some sort of purpose that you may not want to harm them in the process of addressing those pests. So just keeping that in mind in the tolerance to the amount of insects in your yard, and most of them are going to be good. And then another thing that's pretty interesting, and Monica touched on this a little bit, talking about the leafcutter bees, but more specifically, you know, produce leaves that are bitten not only by beneficial insects by bees, but by other insects as well. What happens is they will often trigger a defense response that increases the antioxidants and some nutrients found in that produce as kind of a defense mechanism in the plant. And so if you're okay with eating a leaf that has some bite marks, and of course you want to prioritize food safety, but you know, theoretically, if you were to eat these leaves, they would actually oftentimes have a greater likelihood of higher nutrients and antioxidants found in those leaves. Kind of tying that into going into these barriers and harassment for deer and other large mammals. A lot of larger shrubs and even trees will actually trigger a similar response with deer. And so when deer start to chew the leaves of many trees and shrubs, they will actually produce something in the leaves that will make them taste more bitter for a lot of deer and large mammals, kind of deterring them on their own in nature's way of creating its own barrier. But moving into the harassment and barriers of garden pests and large mammals, deer are unfortunately notoriously difficult to manage. As you can imagine, they can jump quite high, and so you're going to want to have a fence that's at least around 8 feet tall in order to keep them out of your property. But one thing that you can do in replacement of a really tall fence is you can actually have two fences made close to each other, and those only need to be around 4 feet. There's something about making two fences near each other that deer actually don't want to be jumping over them. They would feel a little bit trapped. And so that's a good way to go about it. Of course, here I'm listing a couple different fragrant herbs that work, lavender, rosemary, thyme. They just give off smells that will reduce the deer from wanting to be near your garden premises. And then of course, there's some repellent sprays and homemade sprays that you can look into as well. And we'll go over chemical controls in more detail in a moment. But just keeping in mind the majority, or actually all of them that I'll cover today, are going to be organic chemical controls. For raccoons, you know, I actually have a fair amount of experience dealing with raccoons growing up. I had chickens, and they would really target our backyard because of the chickens. So something to keep in mind, you know, when you're choosing a site to raise your own livestock and things like that. Raccoons can really be a big issue when it comes to backyard chicken coops. They're very, very smart, intelligent creatures. And of course, they can damage fruit and produce as well as backyard chickens. They have opposable thumbs, and so they can actually open latches on gates and fences. And some of these barrier and harassment methods I list here can work pretty well. However, because of the raccoon's intelligence and their ability to adapt over time, you know, oftentimes a dog, a motion activated sprinkler, or those electronic devices emitting ultrasonic frequencies, they'll be able to adapt over time and kind of learn how to go about working around some of these methods. One interesting thing about these electronic devices emitting those ultrasonic sounds is that you can actually change the frequency in a lot of those models to target different garden pest varieties, whether it's deer or raccoons or rodents. And so it's a good way to kind of cater to the audience you're trying to reduce in your yard. So rodents, including rabbits, squirrels, and rats, covering these pests, similar to deer, fencing, in my opinion, seems to be the most efficient option for mitigating these garden pests. Keeping in mind, as Monica had touched on, relocating wildlife in many states is not actually legal, including Washington state. And so although you can get these traps called have-a-heart traps from the Humane Society, it really depends state by state whether those are legal or not. And it's often frowned upon. You know, it's not the ideal first choice in that regard. Another thing that Monica also touched on that's definitely important is to think about some harassment methods, dogs, but especially cats. When you're using cats to reduce these kinds of rabbit populations or rodent populations, there can really be some negative consequences from utilizing them, including all kinds of beneficial bird populations that can be negatively affected. So I know all kinds of, you know, Audubon societies and birders out there are really frowning upon cats being used in this regard because of the detrimental effect they can have on large bird populations. So gophers, voles, and moles. Gophers, we don't really have too much out in Western Washington. We definitely have plenty of voles and moles, and moles are quite common out here. They actually do provide some pest control benefits by eating cutworms, slugs, and different fly larvae, but they can definitely be a nuisance to your garden. So raised garden beds are a great way to mitigate these garden pests, as well as having wire mesh in the ground below the plant. You know, when you're putting the plant in the ground, you would actually have the wire mesh below the root systems. And so once these moles and voles would come and try and attack and eat the tubers or different roots of various vegetables, they would have a hard time reaching them. So again, you know, these different electronic devices and various harassment methods may work kind of hit and miss. And you can also potentially try and use a broomstick to put holes in their tunnels and that kind of thing, but it really is not super effective from what I've understood. And so just learning how to deal with them, adapt, and placing you know, barriers, like I had mentioned, is probably going to be your best bet. In the past, we've definitely touched on in previous classes of talking about soil health and adding you know, compost and mulch in your yard to help increase nutrients and all kinds of benefits. But one thing to consider when you do have a mole problem, you actually want to reduce the layers of mulch and compost bordering your garden beds, because that's a great pathway for moles to travel. Going into birds, of course, there's a lot of great beneficial birds out there, but there are plenty of birds that are gonna, you know, eat all kinds of fruit and produce out of your garden that you may want to reduce in a safe and sustainable way. So row covers are a great way to help fruit protection. There's also something called fruit protection bags you can get, which effectively reduce birds from eating fruit or produce in your garden. When using nets, you really want to be careful and fasten them to the ground. Make them sturdy so no critters can actually crawl under the nets and get inside and then be trapped in where your fruit trees are and where the fruit is. And then another thing to consider is not actually using nets where you can put your finger through the hole in the net, which will greatly reduce the likelihood of critters getting trapped in there as well. So usually those nets are around under 5 millimeters or so. Of course, folks have used different harassment methods, recordings of birds of prey, pinwheels, a neat option of that owl that lights up, although, you know, growing up with tall blueberries in the backyard, I've never had any luck personally with those plastic owls, but it's definitely, you know, worth a shot trying different methods and seeing what works for you. So going into insect pests, Monica definitely mentioned that we would be here for days and days if we actually tried to cover all of the insect pests in, you know, in this region, let alone where all you folks are actually chiming in from across the country and even across the world. And so we're just going to go into a little more detail on a couple of the most frequent or common insect pest varieties in Western Washington. And before we do that, we're going to go into a couple of barriers and preventative methods that work for a wide array of insect pests. So again, as I mentioned, implementing plant options from the daisy, carrot, and mint family can help increase the beneficial insect predators that are in your area, in your yard. And then, as I mentioned before as well, just keeping in mind, the more that you conglomerate one grouping of vegetable or fruit variety in your yard in one area, the higher the likelihood is that insect pests that are targeting that specific fruit or vegetable are going to be able to transfer from one plant to the other. And so it's more confusing to them when they are attracted by color or scent, if those are sparsed out a little bit across your yard, and it's going to be much more confusing for them. So some barriers for insect pests include, actually, I just want to go back really quick here and touch on how, you know, when there's a lot of preventative methods that are they're utilized on a massive scale for large scale farms and that kind of thing, they're much less replicable on a smaller yard. And so thinking about how it would be difficult for a large scale farm to you know, sparse out their crops sporadically throughout their, you know, acres upon acres of land. And so I just want to reiterate that a lot of these practices we're going over today are actually much more replicable for the small scale gardener, as you can imagine. Going back into insect pest barriers, of course, there's some options here we've covered a little bit earlier. Row covers, cutworm collars are actually pretty interesting and really easy to make. You just cut toilet paper rolls or paper towel rolls into 2-inch sections, putting them around the base of seedling, which actually does a great job at preventing cutworms from going and climbing up the plant. When using tar paper or sticky traps, as Monica said, it's really important to look at those frequently and use them with caution. You don't want to be catching frogs and other beneficial wildlife. That's really important to keep in mind when doing that. But if you were to use tar paper, you would just place it kind of around the seedling, similar to the cutworm collar. And then the Qualin clay spray, that's a spray that's typically used on fruit trees. Again, this isn't something that actually kills or eliminates the pests, it just kind of deters them, similar to the marigolds or other barrier methods that we've discussed earlier. So chemical controls, going into these, again, I'm just going to be touching on the organic chemical controls today. It's really important to keep in mind that you're going to avoid using them along near waterways or prior or during a rainstorm. You can imagine a lot of the Obviously, the organic varieties are going to be much more environmentally friendly, but they still can have some detrimental effects on aquatic ecosystems and things of that nature. So just keeping that in mind. Another aspect that I wanted to mention is all of the chemical control methods that I'll cover today are just going to be in the caution category. And so when you're looking at the labels on chemical controls, it goes from the level of toxicity from caution, warning, and to danger. And so, of course, most barrier methods are not going to have a label saying this, but chemical controls with a label will either list one of these three categories in level of toxicity. So non-targeted, that's a really important keyword to keep in mind when looking at chemical controls. Non-targeted, I think Monica mentioned this briefly, is basically it's not going to discern what specific garden pest variety it's going to eliminate. It's going to have a wide swath that it'll take out. And so really understanding that when utilizing this, you want to be very site specific and avoid harm to other plants, or sorry, to other insect pests, or beneficial insects, excuse me, when utilizing this practice. Diagnosing pests is really important to keep in mind. It's the first step in pest control, is targeting the pest affected by area using methods applicable to that specific variety. Making the application as small as possible to correct the situation is important, and targeting areas most in need is really crucial when keeping this in mind. Here's some great resources for diagnosing pests, some good websites to look into. These not only have pest identification in there, but also some least toxic options to include, and also some common health effects of common chemicals used in these organic pest control options. One of our frequent partners is the Washington State University Extension. They actually have a Puyallup office where you can oftentimes send in plant leaves and things in a gallon Ziploc bag, and they'll help diagnose what kind of garden pest as well as bacterial or fungal issue your garden may be facing. To my knowledge, they may not be operational right now, but as soon as the COVID public health concerns are reduced a little more, I expect that they'll be back up and running again. So as I mentioned, going into some common insect pests, I'm just going to go into 3 of the most common in this area, starting with cutworms. One interesting thing is that when they are agitated, they'll actually curl up into a C, which can give you a good idea that it may be a cutworm caterpillar. Some signs is that they will eat seedlings and plants just above the soil surface, and some great barriers include row covers, crop rotation, cutworm collars, as well as beneficial nematodes, which you can actually order online. Aphids, of course, are found all across the country. They're pretty easy to assess if you're dealing with an aphid population. They can be green or pink. They're very tiny, and they're found at the very bottom of leaves, typically raindrop shaped, and they can leave kind of a black fungal looking residue on the bottom of the leaves. Some barriers include just blasting them off with a hose. That's an easy option. You can order ladybugs online, or you can utilize some of the chemical controls, which I'll go into in just a moment. One that I've had luck with in the past is neem oil, otherwise known as oil of wintergreen. And of course, everybody's familiar with slugs and snails. So they can come out in the open at night. They typically feed in at night. So if you want to hand pick them, that's typically the best time to do so. You can also make a very simple kind of slug or snail trap using upside down plant containers or just wooden boards elevated slightly on pebbles above the ground. And if you want to look for them in the daytime, oftentimes they'll be trapped under those objects, and you can just toss them from there. Diatomaceous earth is pretty effective. Copper tape can also be a good preventative measure as well. So targeted organic chemical control. I know there was someone that mentioned in the chat earlier, Japanese beetles are a nuisance for them. So that can be a great way to go about mitigating them is utilizing milky spore, as well as iron phosphate, nosema spore. BTK and BTSD are both bacterial ways to mitigate these pests. I will say that for folks that do have immune compromised issues and they're dealing with maybe some health issues, you want to be very cautious when using those, and just reading the label is obviously very important, and just applying as conservatively as possible. Just a little can go a long way. Non-targeted chemical control, you can see a picture of the diatomaceous earth here, which works for a lot of pests. Sometimes you know, slugs will actually crawl over the surface of the ground, and they won't want to pass that. It can kind of cut them up a little bit. It's really sharp. Other times there's different, you know, beetle insect pest larvae that will be in the soil surface near the base of the plant, and that pest larvae will actually not be able to survive when it is laying near diatomaceous earth at the base of the plant. And so there's a lot of great kind of non or low toxic chemical controls. Again, these are all in the caution category. And so they are very low in the level of toxicity, and great ways to go about mitigating some of these garden pest issues. Again, these are maybe one of the last steps you want to take. So thinking about what kinds of barrier methods you can utilize, what kinds of plant species that you can utilize in your garden to attract beneficial insect predators prior to going about some of these methods here. Again, here's some additional resources, not only on natural pest, weed, and disease control, but also beneficial insect purchasing options. I think some of these websites also you can order beneficial nematodes from as well, also known as roundworms. And so in the natural pest, weed, and disease control link, you can actually find this document in multiple languages translated from the city of Seattle. Well, thank you so much. I will then transition this on to our next speaker. I hope it was informative, and yeah, I appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
While we transition from Joe to David, I just wanted to let you know we're running a little bit behind schedule, it looks like, but I don't think we will go past 11:30. We just may not have as much time for Q&A at the end. So I would encourage you all to keep putting questions in the chat box as David presents, and then Monica and Joe will continue to answer those questions. And hopefully we will still conclude at 11:30. All right, David, you are up. There you go.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about possibly the easiest pests because they don't move. You can find them fairly easily. Eradication is maybe a little bit more difficult though. So I'm going to be talking about botanical pests. We're going to start with a discussion of what a botanical pest is. We're going to talk about the W word. The W word is weeds. A lot of people have different ideas as to what constitutes a weed. So we're going to talk about this from a very specific botanical standpoint. So you don't need to know all of this, but it's just to kind of give some background on weed versus noxious weed versus pest, and just some other terms that we're going to be using. So a weed is any wild plant that is growing where it is not wanted. A pest is any destructive organism that attacks crops, foods, or livestock. The actual definition of a noxious weed is a weed which is considered to be harmful to the environment and animals, especially one which may be subject to the regulation of governments attempting to control it. So we have a specific definition of noxious weed here in Washington State. That includes in Snohomish County and King County, and at the state noxious weed board level. These are divided up into class. The classes are divided by the levels of control, not how bad we think they are, but how hard we need to work to control them and the ways in which we're going to control them. And control is divided up into contaminant tolerance and removal of noxious weeds. The last word I'm going to let you guys know is the term alleopathy, or the term allelopathic, which is the chemical inhibition of one plant by another due to the release of toxins in the environment and substances acting of substances. There are some of these weeds that I'm going to be noting they are allelopathic. And I want you to know that, because if your issue is, I don't want to rip these out, I just want to plant something over the top of it, it may determine a different method of control. So we're going to talk, let me mention the noxious weed boards. So again, we have the definition of noxious. We have the class system here. A is a non-native with some limited distribution. A B is a non-native which are limited in some areas. And C is a widespread and of concern to agriculture. The noxious weed board is primarily concerned with agriculture, but weeds that are issues to agriculture, noxious weeds that cause problems for farmers, are going to cause problems for the average homeowner as well.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
It's Kristen. I think your audio is just a little bit soft. So if you could just, I think all you need to do is just talk a little bit louder.
Okay.
And it should be okay.
Well, no one has ever said that I talk too quietly before.
Okay.
That is fine. These are some links which will be distributed in the slides after the fact of the Washington State Noxious Weed Board, as well as the King and Snohomish County Noxious Weed Boards. These are the weed boards that we interact with most commonly, and they're the ones that if you live in King or Snohomish County, you will want to interact with specific questions about specific weeds. So similarly to my other speakers, we are going to talk about control, but I'm going to kind of briefly go over control here at the start, and then when we get into specific weeds, I'm going to talk about the methods of control specific to those. So in general, the 4 types of control, tolerance, harassment, removal, and lethal control, do apply to weeds and noxious weeds, but they're a little bit more general. So tolerance is a matter of helping the plants that you want to grow more effectively around weeds. Like I said, sometimes that's possible, sometimes that's not. Another method of tolerance is tolerance on your part. If there are things that you consider weeds and you realize that you're just not going to be able to get rid of them, and you're just not willing to put in the effort to get rid of them, maybe learn to live with them. Maybe go, well, I guess this, we'll have an uneasy Cold War in my lawn here with this with the dandelions or with the clover. Harassment and barriers. A great example of harassment is other plants, similar to having some types of mammals that can outcompete other mammals, or ladybugs and aphids. You can plant a lot of plants that will force out, they are better adapted to our climate, and so they will actually manage to outcompete the weeds. These are rare because weeds are very good at what they do, but it is a possibility, especially if you can, especially in combination with other methods. Another great example of a barrier is mulch. Wood chip mulch, to suppress weeds, especially when applied again and again, or in combination with sheet mulching, is a great way to get rid of some low-growing ground covers. Removal, mechanical removal, that is getting out there and just ripping them up. You always want to get them up by the roots as much as you can, and you want to get almost all of the weeds out if possible. Disposal is a different sort of thing, similar to what Monica said. You never want to transport these somewhere else and say, well, now I guess this morning glory is my neighbor's problem, because your neighbor's problem is going to become your problem again real fast. So you do want to remove it. You want to find a way to dispose of it. And then lethal control. Removal is lethal control. That's the great thing about weeds. If you pull them out, they're probably going to die. A few of them won't, and we're going to talk about those. But removal is lethal control. You want to avoid herbicides as much as possible, especially because these are your yards and you are doing gardening in them. Herbicides are going to cause more problems than they solve. I've spent a long time as a restoration tech, and before that I was a landscaper. I've done a lot of herbicide application. As a general rule, mechanical removal is far more effective, especially on a smaller scale. So let's talk about some common invasive plants. If some of this stuff might be a bummer, because I'm going to talk about how terrible and difficult all these plants are to eradicate, but if you stick with me, I promise we will do a very fun invasive plant at the end. I mean, it's a terrible, horrific plant, but it's also very fun to talk about. So stick with me. I promise it'll be okay. So let's start with one of the worst, morning glory. It is a very small, thin, delicate vine with very lovely, beautiful flowers. That is one of the worst weeds that we have in Washington State. It reproduces from any bit of root or vine. If you miss something and a vine falls back to the ground, it can reproduce from that. It's just, and it breaks super easily while you're taking it apart. It is very, very difficult, and it is very difficult to eradicate, and it spreads so quickly. It often comes from people's neighbors. So this is an incident in which being a good neighbor and talking with your neighbors is a great way to collaborate on things, because I've seen a number of people that have tried very hard to, put their yard right and have this lovely yard, and the neighbor just is not interested in that, and it's coming over from their side of the fence. So this is a great bid for community. Unfortunately, people really like these flowers still. They don't only come in white, they also come in a sort of a magenta and a very deep purple. They're beautiful flowers, but they still sell seeds for this stuff at the hardware store. I see it every time, and I always contemplate just buying up their stock and burning it, because they're people really like them. We don't have a ton of really flowering climbing vines in Washington State. We have some, but people really like this, and they think, oh, what a beautiful flower. One note to this: after you do mechanically remove this, do not compost it. It will almost certainly come back, and it will use your compost like rocket fuel, and it will come back with a vengeance. There are specific ways that you can get rid of it. If you have a green bin, that's kind of the easiest. If you don't, there are some other tactics to make sure that it doesn't come back. Bamboo and knotweed. These are similar styles of plants. Bamboo is not technically an invasive species, and it's usually not a weed. It's usually an ornamental that runs amok. But they're very similar styles of plants. And they're these hollow, kneed, climbing, almost grasses. And they spread the same way. They spread through mats. They form these really, really tough mats, and they come up from the mats. Removing them is very difficult. You have to dig in and rip the roots out, as well as hack all of the stalks down. You usually have to do it for several seasons in a row, because there's always some that you miss, and it's always coming back. Even though they are a real issue, I will note knotweed is really popular with pollinators. Bees really like knotweed. You can find knotweed honey and blackberry honey in a lot of places. So if you are struggling to get that last little bit out, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is impossible, I mean, still definitely work on it. But as a bright side, you are helping some of the local pollinators, especially mason bees. Ivy, also called English ivy. Everybody should recognize this. It is a very common ornamental. It looked really good next to brick buildings. It looks like you're part of the English countryside. It is way out of control here. If it gets into crawl spaces, it can actually compromise the foundation of houses. It's very, very rough. It comes up in enormous mats. You can also, it's probably the easiest way to get rid of it is to just start cutting it and then rolling it, and then cut it and then roll it, and just kind of roll it up like a big carpet. And just do that little by little, tearing out the roots as you go. The good news is that this is easier to do in teams, and if you cut and roll and cut and roll and cut and roll and are very methodical about it, you really can make headway on it. You have to make sure that it's not coming in from the edge, but once you eradicate it, it doesn't just sort of come back. Make sure the roots get back. It doesn't lay seeds in the same way that a lot of these other ones do, so you don't need to worry as much about the seed bank. You can shade it out as well. There is hope when it comes to English ivy. You just need to be proactive about it. If you have ivy on trees, it is extremely dangerous because it will cause trees to die, and will turn them into enormous snags, especially our beautiful Doug firs. If you see ivy that's climbed 30 feet up a tree and go, oh my gosh, there's no way I'm ever going to get that down, great news, you don't have to. You can cut a ring about 1 foot wide in the ivy. Just make one cut at the top and then go down about 1 foot and then make another cut, and all of the ivy going up that tree will die. They need access to those roots. If you cut it off and don't give them a place to the other ivy up the tree, a way to continue to feed nutrients up, the ivy up the tree will die. And then you still want to do that mat holding thing and get it up from the bottom. But I actually just last week was out on a site where somebody had done this over the course of a couple weekends, and it was very, very effective. Blackberry, ubiquitous blackberry, all over the place. It is spread by birds. It loves open and disturbed areas. So large empty lots, seeds get in there, and this stuff just absolutely takes off. It spreads from the rhizome, which is a root nodule, interconnected root nodules, and it spreads when it gets too tall. It sort of bends over when it gets too tall, hits the ground, and once the stalks hit the ground, they take root again. And that's how you get these massive thickets of just sort of bending and kneeling and bending and kneeling and bending. If you are going to get these things up, you want to try to get them up early. You want to cut it down and then dig the roots up. I don't have to tell you this stuff. This stuff is that's really sharp thorns. Get thick gloves, wear thick clothes. If you can, PVC gear is very helpful. Dig in, but cut it all down, rake it away, and then start trying to dig up the rhizomes. Don't try to get it all in one go. I've seen people do that. When you're digging up the rhizomes, branches, these vines flying around, you're going to get stuck in the face. Don't try it. After you dig up the roots and pull it out, stalks are gone, the roots are out, you go, cool, I've cleaned out this whole area. It's now free of blackberry. High five. You want to immediately replant something because these fruit are dropping seeds as they're in place, and the seed bank is just full of it. And as soon as there's nothing else growing there, there's no shade, these things are coming right back up. They are totally fine with it. You've just created the perfect habitat for them to come back up. Also, don't compost this. There's a way to take care of this. It's called the blackberry raft, but you basically want to let the stalk shrivel and die rather than putting them back into a compost pile. Like we said, as soon as those shafts hit fertile soil, they're going to take off again. And the seeds are the same way. So you want to eliminate these guys separately. Holly. This is a personal crusade. People love holly. I actually had a friend a couple years ago ask if I could transplant a holly tree that we found into her backyard. No, absolutely not. These are a menace. They are, as long as they have a male and a female in relatively the same area, they will come back up through seedlings. They reproduce extremely quickly. If you get them early and they're not very large, you can yank them out by the roots very quickly. You can yank out holly seedlings all day, every day. They're very simple, but once they get established, they're very difficult and they keep coming back from the root. So not only do you have to take you have to cut it down and dig the root up, but if there's any part of the roots left, the holly seedlings are going to keep coming back up from that stump. And they're going to be very difficult to get rid of. This is something that almost put me through college because I just spent time just digging out holly roots all the time. Strongly recommend, if you see them, get rid of them. These are very easy to mistake at a casual glance from our local Mahonia species, our Oregon grape species. You can tell the difference if you get up close. The Mahonias are not this spiky, they're not this shiny. The holly is extremely distinct. If you look at it and think Christmas, it's probably a holly tree. And if you really, she really wanted this planted so that she can make holly reeds. There are holly trees in parks everywhere. If you really want to make holly reeds, go to your local park, do them a favor by destroying a holly tree and use those to make your reeds. But also talk to the park officials first. Laurel. So this is an interesting one. So there are several types of laurel. Some of them are worse or better than others. Some of them are native, some of them are not. As a general rule, laurel is toxic and extremely common. They are very common hedgerow plants. Cherry laurels in particular, they're commonly put up in residential neighborhoods as these hedgerows. Their leaves and berries accumulate arsenic. They can be deadly to birds and wildlife. They can be deadly to dogs if they get to the sticks. They're also an issue for composting. If you take laurel leaves and laurel branches and compost it, your compost might not be usable. So call someone to cut it down, unless you have a way to cut it down and distribute yourself. Wear a mask while you're doing it. I know we all wear masks when we're outdoors anyway, but really do, and also make sure to wash your hands and shower immediately afterwards. It's just not something you want to mess with. Fennel. Fennel. People might be surprised to hear that we have fennel here in Washington State. Yes, and it's a weed. It's an invasive. It is not a hardy plant. It's actually really weak. Its roots don't go very difficult or don't go very deep. It's an annual. It basically grows up and then dies every single year. And so it just sort of falls apart. It's not a particularly hardy plant. But the reason that it's so successful is because its seeds become extremely loose. And as you are trying to rip it up, you will probably scatter the seeds everywhere. The seeds will go into the seed bank and then it'll come back up next spring. So you should collect the seeds beforehand to keep them from going into the soil. If there's a patch that has fennel and has had fennel for a few years, there are going to be seeds in that soil. And again, you need to plant over the top of that in order to suppress that, keep it from coming back. They like full sun. If you're thinking to yourself, hold on, I eat fennel. Yeah, fennel seeds are a spice, and as long as you clean them correctly, you can eat the seeds that you're harvesting. I am still using seeds that I harvested from a project back in college that was just completely inundated with fennel. I gave some to my younger sister, I gave some to friends, and I'm still eating mine. Of course, there's a lot of things on that. You need to make sure they're cleaned correctly. You need to make sure that the soil they're coming from isn't toxic. Down there, I have a note that says, don't fennel. Don't fennel. Fennel's bad. Don't fennel. That's me covering for not remembering what I was actually going to finish writing. Scotch Broom. So if you've ever been driving on the highway and you see these beautiful flowers and you, like my father, go, gosh, what a gorgeous plant. Those are very invasive leguminous nitrogen fixing plants. They're menaces. They are beautiful. They're awful though. Part of their issue is that they have the same nitrogen fixing nodules that a lot of legumes do. They spread the same way that legumes do, where they sort of split their pods open and send their seeds everywhere. So they're difficult to get rid of. However, absolutely the worst part of them is they have an incredibly deep taproot that if you are going to mechanically remove it will take you a very long time to dig from. And yes, they come back from the taproot as long as the taproot is within 12 inches of the topsoil, which is really rough. So there's a wonderful tool called a weed wrench, which I have heard is available from several conservation districts. I don't know if it's available from ours, and several tool libraries. It's expensive if you're going to get one on your own in order to get a decent one to use consistently. I think they're $300 or $400. But you can borrow one for an afternoon and rip a lot of these weeds out fairly quickly. There's a picture of it down there at the bottom. You can see it's basically just like a clamp and then that pole. But what it does is instead of trying to dig the taproot out, it just sort of uses it like a lever and snakes it right out of the ground. It's extremely useful. Creeping buttercup. If you have creeping buttercup, Godspeed. It is very possible to get rid of creeping buttercup. It's just very difficult. If you sheet mulch and follow it immediately by planting over the top of it, it does enjoy full sun. It will probably start to die back or be less healthy. There's also some plants that may actually outcompete it, including things like salal, kinnikinnick, or wild ginger. But it is difficult, and part of the reason it's difficult is because creeping buttercup is allelopathic, like I mentioned earlier. It actually makes the soil less hospitable and less suitable for other plants. It makes it more toxic. It is very difficult to get rid of. But there is hope. Don't despair. There's a lot of ways to handle it. Dig it up with a pitchfork, sheet mulch it, plant things over the top of it, and you can also have hope. Similarly, this is one that often comes in from ragged edges, so you can clear out your space perfectly. And if there is somebody, a sunny corner of your yard next to somebody who has creeping buttercup, it can still make its way in. All right.
Hey, David,
Yeah.
really quickly, I'm going to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Before you jump into the fun one, there were a couple of really good questions in the chat about how to dispose of some of the invasive plants, primarily morning glory and blackberry, like city compost bins versus composting on site. If you could just give a couple tips for what to do after you remove it.
Yeah, so check with your city compost bin or with your city your city yard waste service and find out if they burned. In some cases, they will go through an industrial composting practice where they actually put things under immense heat and pressure and then get it down to this like nutrient-rich kind of like powder, essentially, that can then be used in fertilizers and things like that. It's sold to do all kinds of stuff. If they don't do that, if they just have like a big city turning facility, don't send it to them because they're going to have the same problem that you are, and they're not any better equipped to handle it on that scale than you are on your small scale. So there's a couple things that you can do. You can burn it yourself. I don't often suggest burn piles, but it is something you can do. You can just torch it yourself. You can put it in your fire in like an outdoor fire pit and just smoke it. You can also, for blackberry, you can build a blackberry raft, which is essentially you just build it up high enough so that none of the stalks will have contact with the ground. And then you stack all of the stalks on top of each other. And then you let them basically just die as their roots contact oxygen and they sort of just shrivel up. And then you can compost it. Similarly, you can build yourself a solar composter. If you want to build a permanent one, usually corrugated metal on the inside and then some sort of plastic over the top is the best way to go. And you can find ways to build these online. They're not particularly difficult. It's basically just like a hot box, but with a plastic top. Or you can build, if you wanted to go even easier, you can just take a large enough cardboard box or a large enough wooden box and put tinfoil in the bottom. The idea is basically you just want something that's going to catch the sun and is going to get as warm as possible. So you want a way to kind of magnify that, and then you want a way to sort of trap the heat in as best as possible. Put stuff over the top. If you've got, this much morning glory and you got a little Amazon box and you put some tinfoil in there and you toss the morning glory in there and you put some saran wrap over it, left it out on your porch, that would probably do it. Leave it for a couple days and don't let it get too cold. You can use a thermometer to make sure that it's above, I think it's 280 degrees. There's better information online that I can pull off the top of my head. But that will handle it. If you're going to do like a large project and you're like, I got to get rid of a bunch of this stuff, I got to take all this, you might be better off just building a larger solar composter that has like a built-in thermometer that you can take the temperature with.
David, one thing I wanted to mention real quick, Monica mentioned this in the chat and I thought it was worth bringing up is excess bamboo that's dried out works great for lattices. So you can just drill small holes with the drill bit in there and use wire to connect the bamboo to itself and make some great homemade lattices.
Yeah, bamboo is another one that you want to make sure that it dies out before you put it back in the ground or do anything like that. But no, that's kind of generally the easiest way to go. There's more destructive ways, but especially for things like morning glory, even if you send it through a wood chipper, the smallest piece is going to be a problem. So actually just killing it is your best bet.
Great, thanks. Okay, you only have 30 seconds. No,
okay. No. So now the fun one, giant hogsweed. This is a funny one because you are almost never going to encounter it. We do have it here. It is extremely dangerous. If you do think that you see it, you need to not touch it. You need to talk to somebody about it. You need to call the weed board. They're going to send people out in correct protective gear to get rid of it because it is extremely dangerous. But it is very fun to talk about, not encounter, but talk about. Part of the reason, I'll do this first. A lot of plants are often mistaken for giant hogsweed. Cow parsnip, angelica, and Queen's Anne's lace are all ones that we have here. So if you, it really only looks like giant hogsweed if it is truly giant. So the person you see there is an average sized person. You can see that it's towering over their head. So if it's coming up to your hip, it's probably not giant hogsweed. It's got to be absolutely enormous. But again, if you think at all, it's the same thing as mushrooms. If you see a mushroom and you think this might be toxic, assume that it's toxic. If you see something and think this might be giant hogsweed, assume that it is and call somebody just in case. The reason for this is not only does it have a very funny, silly Harry Potter name, and not only is it very enormous, it has one of the weirdest toxins that exists in plants. It actually has phototoxic sap, which means that its sap itself is not harmful. But once it touches your skin, it creates a patch on your skin that is suddenly incredibly sensitive to sunlight. It starts with a slight itching sensation and then a burn, and then you get enormous blisters as if you are experiencing the worst sunburn of your life. And it's because of this sap, which is wild to me. And it does mean that it's kind of fun to talk about. But again, it's extremely dangerous. I knew a guy who, because it's very big and their socks are like that, as a child, broke one off and put it to his eye like he was using a telescope, and he still has the scars to this day. It's a guy that I met back in undergrad. I mean, he's fine with it, but he talks about how terrible this stuff is all the time. It really is dangerous. You really should be careful around it. If you do see it, it needs to be eradicated. It is the highest level of control because it is so dangerous to people and livestock. But again, it's unlikely you're going to come across that. But if you do come across that, you need to call the weed board. So that's giant hogweed. Alternatives to weeds. So fast growing ground covers, things to try to outcompete some of the ones that grow along the grounds like ivy or buttercup. Strawberry is extremely aggressive when it's in full sun. Kinnikinnick is extremely aggressive always. Ginger is also extremely aggressive in full sun. One that I did not put on here because it forms massive thickets is salal. Salal is kind of a nuclear option. Salal will outcompete everything and it gets tall. So if you are just like, I am sick of this stuff, I want something native, you might consider salal. Trees that can shade stuff out very easily and don't get enormous. Red alders don't get huge. They get big, but they don't get huge. They also grow very, very quickly, and you can get them from seeds very, very easily. Alder cones are easy to find everywhere. You can throw handfuls of them into your backyard to create shade. Alternatives to pollinators. If you are getting ready to cut down knotweed or blackberry or I guess those are the two big ones. Morning glory, and you think, man, I don't want to screw over the native pollinators. I want to give them something, and you want to plant something in its place. Ocean spray is a great one. Beautiful flowers, amazingly fragrant. Currant, all of the red flowering currants, all of the currants that we have here are also really great options. And I have to give a shout out to sword fern, which is one of the absolute best Swiss Army plants that you can plant almost everywhere in order to create shade. You can get them for inexpensively. They grow up fairly quickly. They tend to kind of grow to the level of their own tolerance. They prefer shade, but they will be okay in sun. They don't take a ton of water. They're evergreen year round. They're really great restoration plants. Lastly, I want to talk about other problematic locals that we have. Lupin, which you see on the top right, on the top left there, is a little bit of a problem. It's also similar to foxglove, which is a similar problem. Death camas, which looks like our native camas, but is very toxic. You can eat the native camas, you cannot eat the death camas. Death camas, I think, is called out by these deep black bands in the middle of the petals. It shouldn't be too hard to notice. Poison oak and poison ivy, you see poison oak in the top right there, are very toxic. You should not eat them. They are also allelopathic. Stinging nettle, I think we all have seen stinging nettle and probably run afoul of stinging nettle before. It is a native, but you should give it a wide berth because it stings you. Poison hemlock, again, very toxic. Bittersweet nightshade, also toxic. All of the nightshade family is toxic I understand that potatoes are in that. The roots of the potatoes are what we eat. We don't eat the greens. Chokecherry, which you can see on the bottom left there, they're beautiful, but they have these very enticing little black cherries. We call them chokecherry for a reason. And then black locust. And then, oh, I left a picture of oleander in there on accident. Black locust is another allelopathic plant. It is a tree that has come over and is now sort of endemic to this area. It's not generally classified as a native. It is allelopathic. It is nitrogen fixing, so it spreads very quickly and grows very quickly, just like red alder. You will notice it by its massive, thick thorns that go all over the base. It's very, very obvious when you're dealing with a black locust. Good news about it, its wood is beautiful. So if you are like me and you are a woodworker and you want some really unique wood, hack down a black locust, man. You're doing your landscape a favor, as well as getting some really beautiful kind of zebra colored wood for yourself. Thank you all. I believe we are moving on to questions now.
Yes, so thank you, David, Monica, and Joe. I apologize, we are over time, but yeah, it's challenging to fit everything in here. And I think Monica wanted to add something really quickly before we open it up for
I see a question or a comment from Franja about chokecherry. I do want to make a note. Some of the problematic natives, some of them like poison hemlock I put in the chat, they are really dangerous for you. I actually have orioles that nectar on them. Okay, so there is a balance between what is problematic about them and whether they're good for wildlife. Lupin definitely is, and it's a nitrogen fixer. I did not have lupin in areas where my horses were grazing because the pods are toxic for them. So the trick again is that knowing your quote unquote pest or problematic thing and the specificity. So if you see anything on a list, especially if you have livestock or pets, chokecherry is a great plant for birds. I found out in talking to David, I was like, wait, people use bay laurel leaves, but it turns out I have cherry laurel, which this is good for birds, but the stems are quite toxic. And I adopted a dog that chews sticks, so it's going, and I'm going to put something safe and native in there where if he chews it, he's not going to die. The other note I wanted to make on natives, David talked about some of them. We did give a native plant talk in the recordings online. Do note that some of these may grow faster in some environments than others, right? So if you're taking care of it and it's in rich soil and has moisture and the right sun, it might grow fast, but you may need other options. So like if you're really shady, I have wood sorrel instead of something like a sun strawberry that's going to be evergreen. So you'll want to do some research on your native plants, but do know there's going to be a difference between what we can be exposed to and what animals are. Stinging nettle's an awesome butterfly plant. And then Kristen has sent me a recipe. I have sworn I am going to eat it in soup this year. I will tell you how this turns out. So just do some research on your plants and get to know which ones are really problematic for you, but may still be good for wildlife, and see whether you can manage them on site.
Yeah, the problematic locals one was mainly just, here are some other interesting ones that I didn't have a chance to. I'm not warning against any of those. A lot of those are just, here's some things that may also cause you problems that we didn't have time to talk about. So yeah, there's a number of those. I mean, and really, if you want to go deep into any of these plants, please contact us to learn more. We're happy to give you resources and talk at length about this. I have a friend who works as a garden steward, and she actually collects creeping buttercup and goes through this whole massive process with the roots to eliminate the toxin, and she uses them like noodles. Like, she makes creeping buttercup ramen with them. I don't suggest doing that unless you go through this very intense process to eliminate all of these toxins, but it just goes to show that there's no one size fits all for these. There's always a way to work on it.
Okay. So I know that we're over time, and we do have a couple questions. So you're welcome to stay. David, Joe, Monica, are you okay to stay for a few more minutes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks for answering for everyone. So let's see, there's a codling moth question I saw. I know Monica had addressed a couple suggestions for how to control that.
Somebody was asking if diatomaceous earth will work for codling moth, and it is used for around the base of trees for codling moth.
Okay.
Swarms of ants are a good thing. Apparently ants will swarm onto codling moth larvae, which are very nutritious.
Nice.
I also posted a couple of quick tidbits on examining the fruit and planting in specific areas. So yeah, some other insight for codling moths in the comments there.
I just saw that. Thanks, Joe.
Mhm.
And then Beth was wondering about any specific tips for common bug loss. I'm thinking goats until I can dig it all out over 3 to 4 years, maybe later offline. Not sure, but I don't know what common bug loss is referring to.
Yeah, if that's a matter of like insects losing, if you're losing insects or if insects are dying off, how do you address that? There's a whole separate thing on pollinators that we could talk about.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think I am going to stop recording.